Testament. Even if you haven't started, if you really got a big hurry on, you could finish up by then. We'll ask for a show of hands. So it's not a pop test. It's not a surprise. So just be ready for it. Tonight we're going to talk a little bit about Philippians. Philippians was a Roman colony. What would happen when the Roman soldiers retired after their service? They would get up groups of about 300 or so and move them to a city. And there it would be a free city where you had Roman citizenship. And Paul loved the Philippians. In fact, he referred to them as his dear brethren. He had a wonderful relationship with them. And Paul talked to them about their attitude and their service to the Lord. And Paul used the term doulos, D-O-U-L-O-S in the English. And it means a bondservant, a bondslave. And a bondslave was someone who was bound even to a greater degree than a regular servant who worked in the house. A regular servant who worked in the house might have some time off, might be able to get married and things like that. But a bondservant was totally, completely committed to his master. And that's exactly what Paul said that he was a bondservant in the Lord. They were partners there. The circumstances that Paul was in when he was writing this is he was in prison. And you can only imagine how difficult this was for the Philippians to hear this, to know that their friend, that their teacher, Paul, was in prison. And yet, imprisoned, not imprisoned, but imprisoned. He was chained to a Roman guard, but he had his own dwelling place to stay in. And while he was there, he had pretty good access as far as his friends were concerned. And he calls them partners. The circumstances that have turned out here, instead of being bad, they've turned out good. He said, you're partners in grace, you're partners in the work of the gospel, and you're partners in suffering for the gospel. What we can learn from this is no matter what the circumstances are, no matter where we find ourselves, instead of looking at the negative, let's do like Paul did and look for the positive and look for the opportunities, because there are opportunities always there. He also mentions that there were some converts among the Praetorian Guard. Now, the Praetorian Guard was 10,000 select troops, hand-picked troops that were loyal to Caesar. And they were kind of his bodyguard. And they were the cream of the cream, the top of the top. And even though he was in chains, he did not let this bother him. It did not keep him from preaching and teaching about the gospel. And we don't know for sure how many in the Praetorian Guard were converted, or even if there were some. But it certainly appears to be that way. Paul said that unfortunately that some people preach out of envy and strife. And we've heard his allusions to this in other letters to Christians. That some have been doubting him as an apostle and have been bad-mouthing him behind his back. In Corinthians, they were told there by some of these people that he wasn't even an apostle. And Paul recognizes that sometimes people will not preach from good motives. They will not teach from good motives. But notice how he takes a negative and puts a positive spin on it. Even though they have negative motivation, they still are preaching the gospel of Christ, and Christ is preached. Paul said, for me to live as Christ and to die as gain. Picture, if you will, a narrow mountain pass, very narrow, with a mountain on one side and a deep valley, a chasm on the left. This is kind of the picture that Paul is presenting here. He's presenting the choices that he has. And to be able to live as a Christian, to be able to live as a bondservant. He was able to say in all truthfulness, if I stay here, I'm happy. If I go, I'm happy. Either one. I have assurance as a Christian that there are certain promises to me. A few years ago, I heard a quote, and I have tried to find the source of this, and I've not been able to locate it. And if you run across it, be sure and share it with me. But in contrast to the assurance and the hope that Paul had, someone once said, "O God, if there is a God, save my soul, if I have a soul, from hell, if there is a hell." What a contrast with the life of Paul and the hope that we have as Christians. Now, it says here that Christ emptied himself. This is sort of like taking something out of a container. Christ, though he was with the Father, though he was in heaven, he gave that up in order to come and walk as a man. I don't understand how somebody can be fully divine and fully human at the same time. But Jesus was. He was touched with our infirmities. He was tempted as we are. He understands what we go through as far as life is concerned. He became a man on the earth that was willing, although he was divine, to walk the way that we walk. Someday, every knee will bow before God. Every professor, every scientist, every criminal, every great military leader, every great politician will someday bow before Jesus. They may not do it today. In fact, they may even laugh and scoff today, but sooner or later they will at the end of the time. And unfortunately, there in Philippi, some of the people wanted the focus to be on them rather than to be on Christ. And Paul emphasized them to focus on Christ because sometime, at some day, at some point, every knee is going to bow before Christ. Rejoice in the Lord. Most focus on living daily lives. Paul focused on living a heavenly life. He was on the earth, but he realized that his goal was to get to heaven. Now, whenever a missile is fired towards an airplane, the missile does not go straight toward the airplane. It goes a little bit to the left, a little bit to the right, a little bit to the left, a little bit to the right. It might be a minute bit, but it's all the time correcting itself on its course to the target. The same is true with other targets, that many times it's self-correcting back and forth before it hits the target. What we have to focus on is to remember that sometimes we lose our focus, but in the long run we have to be faithful to God. Are we just living, or are we living for eternity? This is the mission that we have, that you have, and that I have. To be before others someone that is living not just to live on the earth, not just to have the good life, not just to have things, but to live for eternity. Paul could have had confidence in the flesh. He says that he was a Jew circumcised on the 8th day from Israel. He was the tribe of Benjamin. He was a Hebrew who spoke Hebrew, and he was a trained Pharisee. And he said he was blameless in the law, blameless in the law. Unfortunately, however, he was a persecutor of Christ. He could have bragged about all of the wonderful qualifications he had as far as being a Jew is concerned. But he counted that but loss, and he gave that up. And what he did was he taught the Gentiles that they could be Jewish Christians in heart. they become Jews in their hearts by becoming Christians. It's confusing when you first look at it, but when you think about it, Paul is giving a wonderful promise to the Gentiles that they can be part of God's chosen people. This is the thing that sometimes bothers me a little bit. Forgetting the things that have already happened. There's two different ways to look at this. Number one, we need to forget the times that we've had success and that we've had achievements and that we've done things, that we have accomplished things as though we've done that and that's all we have to do. Because before us, we have always a challenging path. We always have more to do than we can do. On the other side, there's the negative, and that is to forget the things which we need to forget. Now, how God is going to do this, I don't know, but He has promised that He will forget our iniquities, forget our sins. You and I are not strong enough to do that. And so the mistakes we made can be used either way. They can be used as a foundation upon which to build, to not make those same mistakes again, and to grow closer to Christ, or we can let them get us down spiritually and emotionally. And that's what, unfortunately, many people do. Paul told the Philippians to walk according to the pattern. I'm going to share with you a little bit of gossip about the church. Not this congregation, but about the churches of Christ. There are among the churches of Christ some people that we label liberals. I don't know whether that's a good label or not, but that's what they're called. Anyway, they don't believe that the church of Christ, that Christ Church is unique. They believe Christ Church is just one church among many, that there are lots of different denominations, and as long as someone believes in Jesus Christ, everything is all right. We've got brothers and sisters who honestly believe that. And whenever you say, let's go back to the pattern found in the New Testament, they will object very quickly and say, you are a patternist. That's the term they use. So remember that. If you hear that term, you'll know that you've heard it before. That you are a patternist, that you're someone who follows the pattern of the New Testament. And they don't believe that there's any such pattern. They believe as long as you have a good heart, that you love the Lord, that you care about Jesus, everything's going to be all right. Unfortunately, in the church there at Philippi, there were a couple of sisters that were quarreling a little bit. Syntyche and Euodia. And we do not know what the quarrel was about. But we can know this, that when two people quarrel, it's easy to take sides and not understand what's going on. It's easy to show favoritism to one or another when perhaps we ought to just be totally negative and neutral in the situation. Paul tells Clement to try to work with them to help them. And notice, what Paul is aiming for is not just unity. Sometimes we pray for unity, and that's a good prayer. That's a wonderful thing to pray for. But a step beyond unity is harmony. You can tie two tomcats' tails together and throw them across a clothesline, and they'll have unity. But they won't have very much harmony. And the greater challenge for us is to actually live in harmony with one another. In spite of all your bad habits and my bad habits and the weaknesses that we display to one another, what these two sisters were doing with their quarrel is they were affecting negatively. They were negatively affecting the church to the degree that Paul even had to write to them about that. Paul says, rejoice in the Lord. Let your gentle spirit be known to all men. Sometimes we forget that we are a saved people. We forget that we have something to offer to others. And sometimes we are not very tactful whenever we share the gospel with others. My grandfather, unfortunately, I'm sorry to say this, used to go up to the mall in Macon, Georgia. He'd go up to the mall there and sit there on one of the mall benches. And he would come home kind of laughing to himself and laughing to us how he told people that they were going to go to hell. I never quite had the temerity to ask him how many people he had converted. But I sure was thinking it. But I can tell you this, he didn't convert anybody. People that do brain surgery with a pickaxe cannot expect to have good results. It takes finesse and loving and caring, and it takes our own joy in the gospel. Be not anxious. This is the one I worry about. I worry about this all the time, to not be anxious. But one of the ways of fighting anxiety is through prayer. Literal prayer. Pray a prayer of thanksgiving. Pray a prayer of praise. Pray a prayer of intercession for our brothers and sisters who have asked for an interest in our prayers. And by all means, pray for yourself that you be strong enough to resist the temptations that come your way. The anxiety is going to always be there. It's going to always potentially cripple us. But we have an avenue of escape. He learned to be content. Now, I'm interested in this particular phrase, and I zeroed in on this because Paul said that he had to learn to be content. And we may have to learn to be content as well. And it does not come naturally. We're always taught to achieve more, to strive more, to get more, to do more, to be more. When in reality, we sometimes let that slip over, which is good in social life perhaps, or in education perhaps. But we let that slip over into our spiritual lives. And then we find ourselves on a plateau and we're stuck there. Paul says to be sure and focus on the teaching and the doctrine that you've had, and focus on the examples that you've had. I'm wondering how many of us could say to someone who's not a member of the church, just follow me and do what I do, and you'll be all right. That's pretty heavy. Paul was able to do it. And Paul was able, even though he was chained to a Roman soldier, he was content where he was doing what he was doing. He talks about Caesar's household. Now, this could be twofold. It could be people, some of the slaves that were actually literally in the household. It's probably not any of Caesar's kinfolks, but it's people that worked there. Or it could possibly mean that people were Christians who were part of the civil service. They were converted there in Rome, and then they would go out to the different Roman enclaves, and there they would spread the gospel. And they were referred to as Caesar's household. So there were tribunes and judges and different ones that would go all throughout the world there, all throughout the Middle East, teaching the gospel. And there, some of them were actually coming from Caesar's household itself. Colossians. Walk in a manner worthy of the Lord. Paul tells us how to walk. We understand that no one is worthy of being a Christian. No one deserves the grace and mercy we have. But we can walk in a worthy manner. We can walk worthily. It's somewhat like a military man. He's at the edge of a minefield. And someone that comes up to him and says, for you to get safe to the other side, you need to walk in my footsteps. And sure enough, you look out there on the ground, just back and forth, there are footprints. And as long as you stay in the footprints, then you know that you're safe, that you will not have a problem or difficulty. You will not explode one of the mines. 1:13 of Colossians says, transferred into his kingdom. Some versions say translated into his kingdom. And the reason this verse stuck out at me when I read it was that there are some people who have a misunderstanding of the kingdom of the Lord. In Mark 9:1, Paul said, some of you standing here will not taste of death till you see the kingdom come with power. Okay, we can mark that down in that particular chapter, at that particular time, that Paul said that some of you would see the kingdom come with power. Now, he tells the Colossians that they have been transferred into the kingdom. So the kingdom came between the time Christ mentioned it and this time right here. It came on power on the day of Pentecost, Acts 2:38. I share that with you to give you a heads up that as you're talking with religious people, there's some that have the mistaken notion that Jesus came on earth to rally the troops, to call men to himself, but that he was rejected, and this was a surprise. And he did not know that he was going to be rejected. And he was going to build the kingdom then. But because of his rejection, he had to go to plan B. And plan B was to set up the church. And so the church will exist for a long time until Jesus comes back and reigns for 1,000 years. This particular gospel is called the premillennialist movement. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, hopefully, if we get to Revelation, which I think we will. Again, Paul talks about continuing in the faith. And we remember from Galatians 5:4, you're fallen from grace. This teaches us right here that the Christian life is a 24/7 effort. As George talked about, it's in the workplace, it's in school, it's in the neighborhood. And that we must continue walking in the faith simply because it's possible to fall away. Now, does Christ dwell in us? When we become Christians, we have the gift of the Holy Spirit. And we have the gift of Jesus Christ living in us. And perhaps we do not allow ourselves to give as much credit for this as we should. Perhaps we put ourselves down a little bit. In our culture, it's not wise to boast. And we may hesitate for fear of boasting. We don't want to do that. However, we can express a joy and confidence in God and His Word, and knowing that God's Son dwells in us and that we have hope for the glory. Paul took the gospel to the Gentiles, and he proved repeatedly that this good news is for everybody, for Jews, Gentiles, for foreigners, for everyone. Everyone has the possibility of this good news. So we need to be very careful about our examples. Paul now talks a little bit about the philosophy of men. I'm going to mention a group here that we will talk about later, and this is just a real brief introduction. There were some people, and they were called Gnostics. There were some people that felt like the gospel of Christ was just too simple. They heard the gospel. They heard the promises of the gospel. They heard what a change in their lives they could be. But they didn't have to go through a bunch of suffering. They didn't have to hurt themselves or anything like that. So they determined on their own that there was more to being a Christian than the average Christian could understand, and that there were only a select few who could understand what it meant to really be a Christian. And of course, those who taught this were the ones who said that understood. And we're going to notice this some more when we get to 1 John. It's easy to let a good principle, it's a good principle not to say that the gospel is easy, because the Lord has told us that we will have a burden to bear. Jesus will carry it with us, be there for us, but we will have a burden to bear. Notice in Colossians 2:12, and many times we skip over this particular passage of Scripture, but once again we hear part of the plan of salvation. We heard it in Romans 6:3-6. We saw that Jesus died, was buried, and rose again, and that Christians die to the old world, they're buried in water, and rise again to walk in newness of life. And it says, God raised him up. We were buried with him, then raised up, and we're raised up exactly the same way. Paul never went to college, but he had good common sense. And he was talking about greed and idolatry. Notice here that he said that greed equals idolatry. Idolatry equals sin. Therefore, greed equals sin. And I don't know exactly how to explain the nature of greed, except that we have a tendency to want to keep everything we have. That is just in human nature, not to lose anything, but to acquire more. I'm sorry to say, we've got stuff in my garage that I moved here from 1979, and I haven't opened the boxes yet. But it's important. I don't want to throw it out, because you never can tell when I might need it. But that's kind of the way that we are even in our Christianity, that we hold on to things that we don't need in spite of the warnings that we have. Most of the problems facing the church come from within. And let me emphasize this repeatedly. As we are Christians, we must live with a forgiving and a giving spirit. The way the Lord would put it is, look forward to forgiving people that make mistakes. Look for opportunities to be forgiving and to loving, simply showing grace the way God has showed grace to us. This gives you a longer life and happier days. Someone who holds a grudge is simply in a hole with both ends knocked out. I can recall preaching in a little church not far from where Mike preached. It's called Lingleville, Texas. And the brethren are gone now, and I can't remember the names, and I wouldn't call their names anyway. But I was always amazed that there were some of the brethren there who could not remember from one Sunday till next what the lesson was about and what we were talking about and what the series was on. Couldn't remember it. But they could remember August the 13th, 1941, when so-and-so drove by on his pickup truck and he didn't speak to me. And have a long litany of things like that. We need to erase those lists and remember that we're making those lists ourselves. Now, I want you to listen to this very carefully. Juxtaposition. Juxtaposition. I've been teaching and preaching since I've been 15. I've always wanted to use that word, and this is the first time I've ever used it in a lesson. It just simply means look at the placement of something, something that is placed close to something else. Look at these two passages, Colossians 3:16 and 17. 3:16 talks about singing and making melody, and then 3:17 says, Whatsoever you do in word or deed, do all in the name of the Lord. In the name of the Lord simply means by the authority of. And this is how we pattern our worship. This is the way we worship as we do. We see what the Lord has authorized us to do. Has He authorized us to sprinkle instead of baptize with immersion? Has He authorized to use instrumental music? Has He authorized us to whistle, to clap, to hum? I think, and this is me now, I think there's a great significance in that these two particular passages of Scripture are so close together, and we need to take heed to them. Husbands, love your wives and be not embittered against them. We remember from Ephesians, the 5th chapter, that when Paul was talking about Christ and the church, he talked about the love that a husband and wife should have with one another. And what he's literally saying is there, do not use cruel, biting words. You've heard the old phrase, sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me. That is so untrue. I have a good friend who was an Army Ranger, and he's been through all kinds of stuff, parachuting and everything else. And he's really a tough character. You can just tell by being around him that he's got a tough nature to him. And one day he and I were sitting around having a cup of coffee, and something just arose within him. He got real quiet for a minute, and he said, you know, I would rather go through all the physical trials that I've been through. I'd rather go through every one of them again rather than to endure some of the things that people have said to me. And how cautious, husbands, do we need to be with our wives? And wives, how cautious do we need to be that we do not embitter our husbands? It's a two-way street. I personally believe that if the husbands did a little bit better job, we wouldn't have the problems that we do. Let your speech be with grace. Once again, look for opportunities to talk with people. If the subject of religion comes up, the subject of the Bible or the subject of the church comes up, step into the open door. Don't argue. The only way that you can really lose ground with working with the person is with arguing and by showing anger. Somebody says, but I don't know very much to talk to somebody. That's great, because they don't either. And both of you can start from the same place. And what you simply do is you find out what they are teaching, what they believe, what they think is right as far as the Bible and the church is concerned, and you write it down, and you come here and get some help. And you'll get plenty of help for that. Luke, the beloved physician, and Demas were saluting the Christians there in Philippi. But we know that name Demas because in 2 Timothy 4:10, Paul says that Demas forsook them and went back because he loved the world. He talks about a letter from Laodicea. This may possibly be the book of Ephesians, the letter to the Ephesians, but we really don't know for sure. What we can assume is that Paul wrote a lot of letters that we don't have now. Paul wrote 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. And what he had to do was he had to be sure when he was talking to people that they did not hop on their horse and ride off in all directions. And this is why he was so specific as he was. There are 2 letters to the Thessalonians. The first one, he talked about so much about love and grace and mercy and going to heaven that some of the people took it too seriously as far as applying it was concerned, and they quit their jobs and they quit work. In 1844, there was a guy by the name of Miller who taught that the second coming was coming in October. And he convinced a bunch of people of that. They sold their farms, gave a lot of their stuff away, and they waited on the hills to be raised to walk with Jesus in the heavens. October came and passed. Mr. Miller went back and said, I figured it wrong by 1 year. He's going to do it next year. And sure enough, people went through the same thing again, gave away all of their belongings and their valuables, only to be disappointed. Mr. Miller had the integrity to say, I must have made a mistake here. And he quit speculating on the second coming of Christ. Unfortunately, a lady by the name of Ellen G. White did not. She kept on speculating. And she's founder of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. A whole church movement came from her. I'm sorry that we have to go so quickly, but we do, because there's just a lot of material and not enough time. And this is why it is critically important that you read along as we go along. And once again, if there's a phrase or a passage or a word that you're interested in that I don't cover here, probably I won't, be sure and call me aside or give me a phone call and let me know. And I look forward with you to studying with you next week as well. Thank you.